Welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. This is not a normal episode. If you're listening to this, it dropped onto your phone. Hopefully you subscribe to the show. It dropped onto your phone or your computer or whatever you listen to podcasts on a Wednesday. And if you're a regular listener to the show, you know that means this is a special topic, a short topic. We're not going a full length here. And we have with us Donovan Riley, who was just on a recent show, on a recent full-length show. And Dr. Keith got an idea. He's had a lot of people ask him questions about the particular episode where Dr. Nestingen came on and talked about the bondage of the will. And on that episode, he talked about reading the bondage of the will backwards. And a lot of people are kind of confused by what that means or how you would do that. And so Donovan, being a student of Dr. Nestingen who's done this and kind of has experience with this, can maybe clarify
who did his dissertation himself on the bondage of the will.
Theology across bondage of the will, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm figuring that he knows. So here's the deal, Donovan, and we'll call this, I think, probably reading the bondage of the will because people need some help on this. It's not an easy text to digest.
Right. Not in the least.
Right. I try to read it at least once a year, and still, I come out of it all the time. I probably get sucked into reading my highlights, but other than that, I try to come out of it all the time, with an interesting or fresh perspective on it. Here's the thing. Jim comes on. He says, I asked him to do a show on the bondage of the will. I was actually talking about the concept, but he went into the book, which was even better. And he said, hey, read the second half first, which sort of vexed a lot of our listeners because, and what he's talking about for the listeners is there's a portion of the bondage of the will. Erasmus writes the freedom of the will, and Erasmus does this as a good scholastic theologian, scholastically trained theologian, and he does it in a formal disputatio fashion, right? He's posing questions and giving formal answers and posing questions and giving formal answers. And if you're not used to or familiar with the disputatio at all, it's an interesting format. It's not how we would write at all today. Very formal, very philosophical, debate style. You might actually call it formal debate style in a way. Our presidential debates have gone so far south that you'd miss out on that, but maybe
there isn't a name for
get on YouTube and watch some presidential debates from the 50s and you get an idea of formal debate fashion, or if your kids are in forensics, that kind of thing. That's closer to what happens in what I'll call the first part, not the first half of the bondage of the will. And then in the second part, maybe Luther actually just starts talking. Right, he starts explaining. It's more didactic. It's less formal as far as that disputatio style. But what is actually? So Jim says read the first half, the second half first, and the first half second. What do you think Jim means by that?
So,
or how do you handle that?
What you have is a late medieval form of argumentation, which Luther and Erasmus were both very familiar with. They were very comfortable. These debates always took place in Latin. They were academic debates. Erasmus himself considered what he wrote on the freedom of the will to be a polite academic debate. He was basically forced into a corner by several people, including the Pope, to distinguish himself from Luther and the reformers.
He did not want to write on this.
He did not want to write on anything. He didn't want to do this, but they questioned his loyalty to the papacy, and he was in a lot of trouble, a lot of hot water. So he picked what he thought was a completely irrelevant academic topic, freedom of the will.
Nobody would pay attention.
No one cares. So he writes the freedom of the will, this late medieval style. And like you said, Erasmus does what's essentially a word study method of Bible study, is that he basically puts out, I think this is what the Bible teaches about free will. And then he lines up, here's a whole bunch of verses that support free will. Here's some other verses that don't, but there's more verses that support free will than don't.
We can't really know.
And we can't really know, so I'm right, there's a free will.
Right.
And he doesn't mean free will in the sense of we have 100% freedom to earn our own salvation in a Pelagian sort of way, but rather that our will, with the grace of God, participates in our salvation.
Right.
Much like a ship's captain navigates a ship into the shore in the midst of a storm, God is the one giving him the strength to do it, the wisdom, the sight, but it's still the captain who has to steer the ship.
Right.
And so it's God helps those who help themselves, kind of.
Yeah. Right. And I've also argued that a better translation would probably be desire rather than will. I think we take will and we see formal choice, right?
Right.
I have the ability to get up and choose Fruit Loops over Cheerios.
Here's the bondage of the will. Your heart always wants something, and your mind always justifies it.
Right.
That's the bondage of the will. Your will, your desire, your want is captive to your own sinful reasoning. So your heart is always wanting something, and your mind is always justifying it to yourself and others. That's really what we're talking about. And Erasmus is saying then, we have a certain amount of freedom within that with the help of the grace of God. So he puts out this, again, quaint academic thesis, sends it to Luther. Luther responds. He doesn't want to respond. Everybody wants.
Waits quite a while.
Waits a long time. He's busy.
He's goaded into responding.
Well, ultimately, Philip and others go to Katie and ask Katie if she'll talk to him.
Right.
And it's ultimately Katie who says, "Could you please do this so
And
that
over
they
pillow
stop
talk, he agrees.
bothering me?" So he writes it. It's vitriolic. It's very pointed. And Erasmus was completely stunned by the response because he expected a polite academic response.
It's a tome.
As did Melanchthon.
As did Melanchthon.
Yeah, Melanchthon's disappointed.
That's ultimately what led to the division between Luther and Melanchthon later, following that, because Melanchthon chose to stay with
Not the content as much as the tone.
The tone is that he stuck with his mentor Erasmus over and against Luther at that point. And so the bondage of the will then is Luther's response.
I would disagree with that a little bit.
The captivation of the will.
We don't have
however you want
time
say
for
it.
you to disagree with that.
Yeah, we don't have time. That's another special episode. So Luther responds, and it was divisive. It is, again, a point-by-point response to Erasmus's text.
Point by point.
Point by point. And there are a lot of points.
With the inclusion of Erasmus's points.
Yeah,
Right, so-
that's the great thing about
right.
it. You can read it and get both.
So, as an aside, there are two editions of this that you can get. One is the Rupp edition. Gordon Rupp did an edition of the Bondage of the Will, the debate. And then
That's in the Library of Christian Classics.
Library of Christian
Yes.
Classics.
And wasn't Watson involved with that too?
No, Watson
Well-
did his own. Oh, no, Watson did with Rupp.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah,
You're
yeah.
correct.
Right, Rupp. Yep.
And then the second one was Johnston and Packer,
Yep.
which has the superior introduction, but only has Luther's response. I think Rupp has Erasmus and Luther.
I think that's true.
So get Packer and Johnston's edition for the introduction. It's really good. But get Rupp for the back and forth between Erasmus and Luther, because it includes both. And even the Luther's Works edition doesn't have Erasmus, and it just has Luther's response to Erasmus. So here's the thing then. If you're not familiar with late medieval forms of disputation, and it's very easy to get lost in the woods of this debate, what I do...
It's
and
all
what,
forest, no trees.
it's dense.
Yeah.
It's like a bamboo forest. Much like reading a mystery novel, if you open to the end of the novel and read the conclusion and find out who did it, and then work your way backwards through the mystery novel, you already know who the murderer is. You're working your way back through the story.
And you're watching him.
And you're watching him do it. It's like a movie where they show you in the opening of the movie
What happened?
the conclusion of the movie, and then the rest of the movie is them explaining how that happened.
Yeah.
John Wick.
So, that's the best movie ever. Sorry, I just geeked out for a second there. So what you do then with Luther's response to Erasmus is turn to the back of the book and start with Luther's conclusion, where he talks about even if I could have free will, I wouldn't want it because even one demon is more powerful than all of the men on earth combined.
That's a line they're looking for.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's in the appendix or the afterthought, the afterword.
If you get it on ebook, you could actually search
true.
for the
There you go. So start at the back. Just open to the back and read and it's divided up into segments, into parts. And each subheading has a Bible verse or what Luther is going to be addressing in this section, which is a nice editorial move. Start with the last section of the Bondage of the Will, and then work your way forward section by section. So what you're essentially doing is reading Luther's conclusion to the entire debate, which is kind of like, and this is why you're wrong, Erasmus. Now you know why Luther thinks or believes that Erasmus is wrong, and then you can work your way forward
Through his argument.
knowing the conclusion. And then, like you said, the quote-unquote second half of Luther's response is a lot of exegesis and a lot of appeal to Scripture to prove his point. And then you move into the more formal stuff at the very beginning of the debate, which is him responding specifically to Erasmus's point and attacking and disputing.
And
what
calling Erasmus.
Which is,
Yes.
funny. Like, the first time I read it was in high school, and all I remember getting away from it was just, like, how funny it was, Luther going after Erasmus.
It's very hyperbolic in points, yes.
Yeah.
And that, again, that is also a
Such a
style.
nerd. The first time you wrote Bondage of the Will was
I'm
in
like,
high school.
I can remember, like,
Nerd.
bringing it to you. I'm like, have you seen how funny this is?
Yeah. And
That's
you know,
not-
and to our modern ears, because we're so sensitive, it is sometimes offensive how free Luther is with his words and with his insults. But that was very common in
That's
those days
a commentary more on our century than it is on Luther.
Very much so. So yeah, if you want to get a handle, and Luther himself said the Bondage of the Will and the Large Catechism are the two greatest works that he ever produced. And everything else can be burned.
Everything else can be burned.
And the Formula of Concord in 3 places cites the bondage of the will. In Article 11 on election, Article 3 on free will, and then again, I think it's Article 7, but they refer to Luther's works, the Jena edition, which include the bondage of the will.
For those of you who speak English, that's Jenna.
Sorry. Jenna. Nice girl.
Wait, is it 2 N's?
No, it's just one. I'm
Just one.
But if you're going to do it that way. Is that even his own students considered the bondage of the will to be equal to the confessions, the Lutheran confessions, that it was a faithful exposition of Scripture. It's just that it's such a challenging text because it's so dense.
Yep.
Right, and it's not a confession proper.
No.
Yeah, so
No.
it's not a symbolic in that sense.
Right.
Yeah.
And
No, it's polemic.
it's polemic.
Yep.
And like I said, to our modern ears, it is pointed.
So in that way, it'd be like saying that you subscribe to your systematic or dogmatic theology, which we don't. We subscribe to confessions and,
Correct.
and to creeds, right?
Right.
Yep.
And so in an interesting way, it makes sense that it's not included in our formal confessions because it's not that. It's a polemic.
Right.
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 And so I would say approach it that way, that the best way to get into it is start at the end and work your way forward section by section. And then lastly, if you need a kind of Reader's Digest version of the Bondage of the Will, Gerhard Forde, at the end of his life, published a monograph when he was very sick and he didn't have a lot of energy, so he was very economical with his words, and that's why it's such a short text. But it's called The Captivation of the Will, where he...
Edited by Paulson?
Edited by Steve Paulson. Steve Paulson's introduction and Nestingen's introduction to that are invaluable. There's 2 introductions, one by Nestingen.
Who published that?
Augsburg Fortress.
Really?
I think. No, Lutheran Quarterly.
It's
Lutheran Quarterly
Press.
books. Yep.
Okay.
Lutheran Quarterly Press.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I think you can get it on Kindle even, but Steve Paulson and Jim Nestingen both write introductions, which are Nestingen does kind of the historical overall
Just
introduction,
an Nestingen thing.
and then Paulson does the systematic introduction to it,
Of the theology of it.
and then Forde breaks it down basically into 4 sections. I think it's 4 sections in that.
4 sections.
4 sections. It's barely 80 pages with the introduction, 2 introductions.
Right.
But
It's wonderful work.
oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's fantastic because, like I said, he was working with an economy of words, and he was summarizing his entire career of teaching the bondage of the will.
Which is his career.
Yeah, his whole career is that book, essentially.
Yeah.
And Thelonious Monk, the jazz musician, said that a mark of genius is that you can make something complicated seem simple.
Uh-huh.
And that's what Captivation of the Will is by Forde. It's made one of the most challenging debates in church history for readers accessible and easy to understand.
What a great compliment.
And so if you're afraid of getting into the bondage of the will, or you're afraid of kind of tackling it all at one time, go check out
Captivation of the Will
Go
first.
check out Forde's Captivation of the Will and those introductions. It'll lay the path for you, to lay the foundation for you to go through that section by section.
All right, great.
Perfect.
I think this is
on
a good
reading the
introduction.
Bondage of the Will.
I'm going to even add a little extra work to myself, and I will find the page number in Packer where that section that we talked about
That'd be
beginning
perfect,
at
yeah.
goes, and I will include that in the show
just
notes.
for the sake of reading, I prefer the Packer edition
Yeah, the language.
So does Jim.
by a long shot.
Yeah, the language is more. It's more poetic and more prose.
So if you don't
Easier
want to
to
go
read.
searching yourself, go to the show notes for this episode, and I will have the page number.
Excellent.
Plus, with the Packer edition, the table of contents is 29 pages
Yes.
long.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes.
That's a wonderful help for a guy like me that
Yes.
majors in outlines.
Do you have a complete outline?
Yes.
So we can also maybe make that available.
Absolutely. I hand-keyed it.
Okay.
Oh,
All right.
wonderful.
All right, thank you for listening. Subscribe to the show so that you never miss a special drop like this.
They're little Easter eggs.
Yeah, that's right. All right, talk to you later.